Welcome to the Adventist Clarity Podcast, and today, as we promised last time, we are going to continue with our third episode on Conrad Vine presentation. Today we are going to speak about his claims and critiques against ADRA, the GC, and different other topics that he touches on this preaching. As always, let's subscribe to the channel, share your comments. You can follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcast. And I appreciate the comments and everything that the viewers do for this channel.
When it comes to ADRA, I served with ADRA for many years before it went woke. I served with ADRA for almost 10 years, full-time and part-time. I served in Central Asia, Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, time in Afghanistan, South Sudan, Kenya, Haiti, Peru, many other countries as well. I served all around the world with ADRA. I was humbled at the way God worked through ADRA teams to alleviate human suffering. And wherever I was long-term, with my colleagues, miraculously, churches seemed to spring up, despite the no proselytizing policy. But that statement I read to you a few minutes ago from the GC on church-state relations has this statement, this clause. It says, thus, when laws of a nation permit government assistance to churches or their institutions, our principles permit receipt of funding that is not accompanied by conditions that inhibit our ability to freely practice and promulgate our faith. Key phrase. To hire only Seventh-day Adventists, to retain governance by only Seventh-day Adventists, and to observe without compromise principles expressed in the Bible and the writings of Ellen G. White. Now, if you receive USAID funding, you are expressly banned from promulgating your faith. If you receive European Union funding, you are expressly banned from promulgating your faith. In fact, there is not a single institutional donor in the world, British Foreign Government, Japanese Foreign Ministry, European Union, Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Norway, all these major donors, every single one of them bans you from proselytizing. But they are our primary sources of income for ADRA, in violation of our own policies. What it means is we no longer stand up for what we believe, but we swing with where our donors want us to go. Which is why ADRA is an active participant in the climate change treaty negotiations, which will lead to Sunday lockdowns to save the environment, which will lead to Sunday sacredness. This is the problem. ADRA has become financially dependent on USAID funding, even when USAID expressly prohibits proselytizing by employees paid from their funding, and in direct violation of our own policy. Our own policy says that if a donor says you can't promulgate your faith, then we have to shut off relations with that donor. But that is not what we have done. We have ridden that gravy train, and if you look at the ADRA 990s that have been out on the internet recently, there are at least 5 church leaders in the GC. Their travel and honorary expenses range from $60,000 to $130,000 a year, just to sit on those boards. Nobody's going to rock the boat, because key leaders are getting financially enriched by their participation in the gravy train.
Let me answer here to a few claims by Conrad Vine against ADRA. He has leveled serious accusations against ADRA that, of course, demand, I think, careful consideration. His critique does not emerge from a balanced, biblically grounded concern about mission or effectiveness in mission. Instead, he has chosen a different path, and it's the path of the culture wars. This is a highly politicized approach that views Adventist institutions as fundamentally compromised and in need of radical overhaul or complete dismantling. By importing divisive political strategies into ecclesiastical discourse, Vine seeks to reform the church through the same polarizing methods that characterize today cultural battles and political battles. And he has weaponized this concept of woke against the church. Vine's entrance charge that ADRA has become woke requires serious scrutiny, I think. The term woke has evolved from its original meaning into a weaponized political tool designed to dismiss and discredit rather than to engage in a conversation that is substantively, right? It is routinely applied to anything addressing racial injustice or inequality, environmental stewardship and climate action, economic disparity and humanitarian assistance, historical accountability and immigration support and refugee assistance. All of that, it seems that today is woke, right? So woke is not a term that only encloses a few things. It is a conversation that has included a big package. And so let's then go to the claim whether ADRA supposedly has embraced wokeness. And the question is it because ADRA pursues comprehensive climate solutions? Is it because ADRA has collaborated with UN climate change conference initiatives to improve conditions of vulnerable populations and communities? If these partnerships constitute the evidence, then Vine and his supporters appear to believe that any association with international bodies, regardless of humanitarian purposes, represent an inherent corruption and a spiritual compromise. This suspicion reflects a long-standing problematic trend within certain Adventist circles. Some Adventists, not everybody. For some, the United Nations has become a convenient scapegoat, a boogeyman, and the UN is cast as the harbinger of Sunday laws and end-time persecution. Yet, this fixation is both selective and I think is misplaced, but especially selective. Why single out the UN as the ultimate threat while ignoring, for example, other organizations like G7, G20, NATO, right? Or even the growing influence of Christian nationalism in America, which of course seeks to reshape law and society according to particular religious agendas. Why is the UN then, among all global institutions, become the focal point of this apocalyptic anxiety? So to come back to this paranoia, where in Scripture are we instructed to withdraw from doing good simply because secular institutions are also pursuing beneficial outcomes or other outcomes? Are we not called to be stewards of God's creation, to take care of the earth and its population? Isn't the Sabbath, the commandment itself that we promote, the one that establishes our role as caretakers of the planet? Should ADRA face condemnation for helping African communities to access clear water or improve agricultural sustainability? Does this constitute a dangerous wokeness trend? Or is this just a faithful service in Christ's name? So, the accusation that ADRA has gone woke is not merely weak, it is reckless and potentially destructive. To my knowledge, ADRA has not launched campaigns promoting LGBT plus rights or devoted resources to rewriting colonial narratives or promoting Marxist ideas. Instead, it has focused on humanitarian relief, sustainable development, alleviating human suffering, precisely what a Christ-centered agency should prioritize, right? So by branding such work as woke, Vine risks undermining one of the most visible and effective institutions that we as Adventists have worldwide. His critique reveals more about the political lenses through which he views the church than about ADRA's actual faithful work around the world. And so let me just tackle here this problem about government funding. Vine claims that by ADRA receiving government funding from agencies like USAID, explicitly then faith is prohibited from being shared. This assertion is a little misleading and demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding on how this partnership functions. And I don't think Vine does not understand that. I think he does. They think he manipulates his speech. ADRA receives USA funding through competitive grant applications for specific humanitarian projects, as any other NGO out there. When USAID provides funding, it provides resources for ADRA to execute particular initiatives as proposed in the grant. For example, USAID funding of ADRA program in Colombia, which was called Optimize Health and Watch Activities, was a project to assist Venezuelans migrants in Colombia through health screening and medical kits. The project developed 2 mobile units equipped with generators, medical offices, medication, restaurants, wheelchairs, and some of them provided some essential transportation to primary care to those migrants in Colombia. So using designated project funds for evangelistic material or Bible distribution will constitute, of course, incur in grant fraud. And it is a serious violation of the ethical standard of ADRA, right? So ADRA rightfully prohibited from redirecting funds designed for specific humanitarian efforts to do, spiritual activities regardless of how good they are for the church or not. And so I think he portrays a misconception about ADRA. According to ADRA's governing bylaws, by the way, the organization does not engage in proselytizing, and this is something he recognizes. ADRA expresses God's love through programs that serve in people in need regardless of race, gender, political affiliation, or religious background. ADRA operates effectively across diverse cultures, traditions, and faith communities while respecting universal human dignity. So the organization Global Impact validates the heritage of this benevolent service while, introducing Adventist values through practical demonstration rather than verbal persuasion. ADRA doesn't do a lot of verbal persuasion about convincing people to become Adventist. ADRA operates with a code of conduct that he knows. Conrad Vine knows that code of conduct. And it was adopted not only by ADRA, but by other institutions like the Red Cross and other NGOs, right? And the code explicitly states that, I quote, aid will not be used to further a particular political or religious standpoint. Aid is given regardless of race, creed, or nationality. So, what about the church policy on government funding that he quotes in his critique? Vine selectively quotes church policy on government funding while omitting the crucial context of the policy itself. The same document he refers clearly states in a different paragraph that he ignores that, quote, when Adventists receive government funding, we must handle such funds with the highest integrity. These include strict compliance with the regulations attached to the funding and the use of rigorous accounting standards. If procedures are not in place to ensure such compliance, funding must be reviewed. Imagine ADRA receiving money, let's say from the European Union or USAID, and the project is meant to buy, machines to clean water in vulnerable communities. Then imagine ADRA taking that money, let's say to do some part of the money to do evangelistic campaign, evangelistic series, or preach the gospel. That would be a violation of the policy, right? So this policy demonstrates that the church recognizes both the legitimacy and responsibility of accepting government partnerships when they serve humanitarian purposes and maintain ethical standards. So, and the other thing that he seems to confuse people with, and I know he understands that, but he just wants to confuse people, is the idea that he is equating the Adventist church with ADRA in the same package. And I think it's a fundamental mistake, because there is a crucial distinction between the Seventh-day Adventist Church and ADRA. And Vine just appears to conflate the two things. So the Adventist Church, as a church, right, is a religious denomination with spiritual, doctrinal, and worship functions. It focuses, as an Adventist Church, we focus on evangelism, education, health care, and spiritual development within Adventist theological frameworks. And ADRA, although it's Adventist Development and Relief Agency, is a humanitarian non-profit organization that maintains legal independence from the church while preserving institutional affiliation. So ADRA focuses on disaster relief, community development, poverty alleviation, and humanitarian assistance regardless of recipients' faith backgrounds. So they are governed by an independent board of directors and operates according to NGO standards. So while, of course, ADRA is alienated with the Adventist principles, ADRA is not a church, right, and does not provide religious services or direct evangelism. So that is a very clear distinction. And this was the idea of ADRA since it was created back in the 50s, in the 1950s. So although ADRA reflects Adventist values, of course, of service, stewardship, and humanitarianism, it maintains operational independence, particularly to comply with international aid standards and government regulations. ADRA does not proselytize. While the SDA Church explicitly teaches and promotes its doctrines, our faith, right? And both approach services from different perspectives. ADRA does the humanitarian branch of the church and pastors and unions and everybody else in the church does the proselytizing part, right? And so Vine's accusations against ADRA reflect a traveling trend toward political polarization within the Adventist discourse. Rather than strengthening our mission, our effectiveness, rather than criticizing whether ADRA is being effective or not, then and when I say we, I say Conrad Vine, he begins to attack and undermine one of our most successful humanitarian expressions that we have in the world, present in almost all countries out there. So I think we must resist the temptation to import secular culture wars into ecclesiastical debates, and instead evaluate our institutions based on their faithfulness to Christ's mandate to serve the least of these, because that's exactly what the Bible says. So ADRA's work represents authentic Christian service, in my view, feeding the hungry, caring for the sick, and providing hope for the hopeless. These are not political positions but gospel imperatives. We should celebrate, support, and refine such ministry rather than attack these ministries with political rhetoric that serve to bring division rather than focus on mission. So, and that is, I think, my message to Conrad Vine and his followers, right? First, I think he does willingly promotes misinformation, right? And second, he conflates the Adventist Church with ADRA as the same thing. ADRA is an Adventist humanitarian agency, but it's run separately because as an agency, it needs to comply when they receive funding. In fact, in the local church, when you give money to the children ministry, you don't want that money to be spent in something else, in something different from the children ministry, do you? The same thing happens to ADRA when they receive funding from whatever institution they get funding from, right? So you expect them to comply with how the money should be spent. And of course, there is nothing wrong with that. It's part of the law. It's part of the ethical code that ADRA subscribes to. And yes, there might be many problems with ADRA. There might be ways in which ADRA can become better. But I think this way of politicizing ADRA is not the way.
So, UN consultative status. I'm talking here not just about the recent path, but the wrong path that we're on right now. If you want to apply to become an NGO with the United Nations, you go through this process here. It's on the Economic and Social Council website of the United Nations. And in 1985, the General Conference became an approved NGO, consultative NGO status with the United Nations. ADRA International also has the same NGO status. This allows you to sit in key meetings, to share your voice, to share your concerns, etc. But the key point is that if you have consultative NGO status with the UN, you must uphold the values and goals of the UN. That's what the documents legally require you to do. And Brother Henk Viljoen, an attorney, a banker from South Africa, now in Australia, if you look at his Pearl campaign, he did a brilliant interview and analysis last week on YouTube on the unholy alliance between the GC and the UN. And you look at our filings with the UN, and when we started in 85, the Adventist Church exists to promulgate the three angels' messages and prepare people for the coming of Jesus. And 20 years later, the Adventist Church acts to uphold the values and goals of the United Nations in our official filings. We've evolved over the years to keep in the good books of the United Nations. Now, the United Nations has millennium. These are the goals we are signed up to. This is what we are committed to supporting at the United General Conference. The Millennium Development Goals, maybe you've heard of them. Close to 40% of the population of the developing world lives in extreme poverty only 2 years ago. Since then, the world has halved extreme poverty. That's good news, with the UN's Millennium Development Goals greatly contributing to this process. Now, those Millennium Development Goals are now known as the 2030 Agenda. Have you heard of that? The 2030 Agenda. We are committed as a General Conference to supporting the 2030 Agenda. Legally, because we have consultative status with the United Nations. And this is what it says, Agenda 2030. This is taken from the UN's own websites, recognizing the success of the Millennium Development Goals and the need to complete the job of eradicating poverty. The UN adopted the ambitious 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which includes ending poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace, justice and strong institutions, and partnerships for the goals. Now, actually, we could agree with a lot of those things as Christians, like eliminating poverty, absolutely. Goal 13, because there are a certain number of goals with the 2030 Agenda, urges the world governments to take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. We know from Laudato Si and the book Great Controversy that climate change and climate emergency will be used as the excuse to enforce Sunday sacredness. So when we are committed to supporting the UN climate change agenda, we are committed to upholding Sunday sacredness. Goal 10, reduce inequality within communities. This is what the United Nations website says. Even the richest countries still have communities living in abject poverty. True. The oldest democracies still wrestle with racism, homophobia and transphobia and religious intolerance. Global inequality affects us all, no matter who we are or where we are from. And there are some things there that we don't want to see, and there are things there that we can't agree to. We can't agree to, we want racism to be eliminated, it's a reality, but we are not concerned so much about eliminating homophobia and transphobia. What that means is, if you are signing up to the 2030 Agenda, you're committing yourself to promote trans ideology. That's the net effect. Goal 10, like all the other goals, that is on climate change, includes very specific goals. Here's one of those goals. This is from the UN website. The goal of the UN is to facilitate orderly, safe, regular and responsible migration and mobility of people, including through the implementation of plans and well-managed migration policies. And what's happened over the last 4 years across the southern border, with many NGOs, including ADRA, facilitating the mass migration into America, is part of this agenda. That was effectively one of the largest human and sex trafficking operations in human history, and we have been complicit in that. We are complicit in that. The General Conference of SDAs and ADRA both have consultative status at the UN with the ECOSOC. That's he said on the screen there, the Economic and Social Council is the heart of the United Nations system to advance the three dimensions of sustainable development: economic, social, environmental. It is a central platform for fostering debate and innovative thinking, driving consensus, forging consensus on ways forward, and coordinating efforts to achieve internationally agreed goals. It is also responsible for the follow-up of major UN conferences and summits. So, when you have consultative NGO status with the ECOSOC of the United Nations, it requires that entity, that NGO, to support and contribute to the goals of the UN, including Agenda 2030. Some of which we can support in good conscience, and some of which, such as coordinated climate action leading to Sunday lockdowns or trans rights, we can never support in good conscience. Mass migration, regardless of the wishes of the receiving community, is part of the Agenda 2030. Hence, ADRA has been actively working with the Biden administration in the mass migration of migrants up through the Central Americas.
There is another claim that Conrad Vine does regarding ADRA. And he says, quote, ADRA has facilitated or has been involved, right? That's the same thing, with mass illegal migration to the United States. If true, right, this would be an extraordinary serious allegation and deserve even, right, prosecution and legal action. Is it just suggesting that ADRA collaborated with human smugglers or drug cartels to transport migrants to the US? Is it claiming that ADRA organized migrant caravans and provided instructions on how to enter the country illegally? That's what ADRA did? Or is it referring to ADRA's humanitarian projects in countries like Colombia, Mexico, where the organization provided essential services to migrants, clean water, hygiene kits, health screening, clothing, and education? How does offering these basic human necessities constitute facilitating illegal migration? Right? Conrad Vine is engaging in two problematic behaviors, I believe. First, he is misleading Adventists, members about ADRA's legitimate humanitarian efforts, and second, he is deliberately blurring the lines and the critical distinction between providing humanitarian aid and facilitating human trafficking. These are fundamentally different things. One is a criminal activity, right? It's a criminal offense. The other is a humanitarian work recognized and protected under international law. Vine's characterization ignores essential truth about migration, right? Migration is an extraordinary, difficult, and challenging experience for those who undertake migration. Migrants often find themselves in vulnerable situations in foreign countries, struggling to access basic human needs such as sanitation, clean water, or adequate food. And so the migrants, right, that ADRA was, for example, helping in Colombia, were not illegally there in Colombia. Most of them were Venezuelans who were legally allowed to remain in the country. And whether any of these individuals later attempted to enter the US illegally or sought asylum is unknown or was not the concern of ADRA, right? Their mission was straightforward. The field workers there, of the ADRA field workers, the objective was to address immediate human needs. ADRA provided essential services to 115,000 migrants, offering them basic things to alleviate the suffering during an extreme vulnerable period. This was a work that was in the fundamental level providing, right, aid to those in desperate need, regardless of their legal status or future intentions, right? ADRA field workers don't know if some of the migrants that they helped in Colombia were trying to come illegally to the US or look for asylum for that matter, right? And that was not the problem of ADRA. The problem was that let's provide water, health, and help to these people that are in need, that don't have tents to sleep, that are truly going through difficult situations. Let me ask you one thing, Conrad Vine. Is this illegal? Is that a crime? If that is a crime, then yes, ADRA should be prosecuted for such an illegal thing ADRA did. I want to add a follow-up to these concerns and claims by Conrad Vine. And let me begin by saying that the heart of this critique against ADRA and the GC is the belief that the UN is a dangerous entity that eventually will promote Sunday laws and persecute Adventists. How did the UN end up on the top of our apocalyptic fears? What is it about the UN that could unleash all of this? Aren't there other multilateral organizations and unions that also seem to threat and promote restrictions to religious liberty and that could lead to Sunday laws and persecution to the Adventists? I will give Conrad Vine a list of other organizations to watch for, to look at. What about the G7 or the G20? Both of these organizations are of the most powerful nations in the world. Essentially, these are the most powerful nations that belong to the UN, by the way. And they have their own union, G7 and G20. What about NATO? Right? A big military alliance between the most powerful nations in the world against common threats and dangers, right? They have military. They have everything to enforce whatever they want if they so wish. They have the power to suppress with military might. What about the World Trade Organization? Isn't this what Revelation 13 talks about? That nobody could sell or buy, only those who have the mark? So what about the World Trade Organization then? Isn't that the job of the World Trade Organization to emit laws around trade that could essentially lead to something else? Like, I don't know, Sunday laws? What about the European Union? Right? What about the League of Arab States? Profoundly difficult to be a Christian and an Adventist in those countries. But I get it, right? Probably not. Then I have one more. What about the Organization of American States? I have a better one to be concerned at, which is the recent threat of Christian nationalism in this country and around other areas in the world. Isn't Christian nationalism a bigger threat and danger than the UN? Why is this something about the UN and in particular to ECOSOC, right? The Economic Council. Maybe it is because the UN is a big organization and very complex, right? With different branches participating relatively independently from one another. But what about the UN that has become, right, the boogeyman for some Adventists? Many Adventists who hold these extreme apocalyptic fears want to cut any relation to the outside and engage in a more, sectarian practices to protect themselves from all these monsters like the UN. I am saying this just because it is difficult to understand how the end times will happen. But it seems that Conrad Vine has become very specific. He is saying that the UN, because of this climate and other concerns, will at the end enforce Sunday laws. The UN, an organization that lately is just meetings every year, that doesn't have any teeth or power to do many things. Why the UN, right? And that's the difficulty about this. And is that we can look for specific things and yet be so uncertain. Because the way we understand those apocalyptic events are in broad terms and explanations that do not go down to the specifics. But this seems to be very specific. What if it doesn't happen that way? Because according to the Great Controversy, and this is what Conrad Vine says, that the Great Controversy says that climate change will be an excuse to enforce Sunday sacredness. But I don't think so. I don't think the Great Controversy makes this claim about climate change. And by the way, this is not a phrase that Ellen G. White uses. She refers to, climatic world problems, but how are we so certain that this is the way? If so, right, the SDA support for a climate change agenda is then the way in which we are doomed to be persecuted by the beast. How are we so sure, and again, the same question, how are we so sure that this is how this is going to happen? And why Conrad Vine seems to make such bold statement? And something else I want to touch on. Although Conrad Vine recognizes that we can agree with some goals of the UN and the 2030 agenda, he says essentially two things: that we cannot agree with, the climate change agenda, which very interesting for me, because how is it that we Adventists are not participating in that discussion? How is it that we are not doing more when we are Sabbath keepers, right? The day that is about God as the creator of everything, and the one that put man in the midst of the garden to keep it, a caretaker of the planet. Why isn't that we are not doing more for that? But something else that he says is in regards to, that the UN is concerned with eliminating homophobia and transphobia, and this is not something we agree with. What is the meaning of that? Because as far as I know, homophobia and transphobia means hate against these two groups. And of course, we can combine them in one group. But it's about hate. That's what homophobia and transphobia means, hate. So are we supposed to feel okay when there is hate against those communities? Are we supposed to feel okay, just, hate? Isn't that so contrary to the Christian values and to Christ himself, who loved the sinner, who embraced them, who served them, who helped them? And I understand that we do not share this sexual identification of these people. But that is one thing. Hate is something different. Hate is the very thing that we Christians are supposed to fight against, and we are supposed to love even our enemies. But, trans and gay people are not our enemies, for this matter. Maybe we are not supposed to support the trans or, LGBTQ plus agenda. But that is one thing, right? The other thing is, we are not also supposed to be okay with hate. What is it then, Dr. Conrad Vine, that you are trying to say here? What is it?